Winter 1942. Under the leaden skies of Russia, a man stands tall, defying a wind that carries the scent of frozen metal and impending catastrophe. This is Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. He was not a product of Nazi ideology. He was the scion of an ancient Prussian noble lineage, a direct descendant of Frederick the Great's most famous cavalry general. For centuries, his family name had been etched into military textbooks as a synonym for honor, discipline, and uncompromising loyalty to the crown. A general of artillery, a corps commander, and a recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, he was the embodiment of the Wehrmacht in its most powerful and coldest form. His uniform was flawless, his gaze as sharp as a bayonet, and his devotion to Germany was unquestionable. But Seydlitz was no blind follower. He was an old-school strategist who, gazing across the endless Russian steppes, began to realize a terrible truth. In the snow outside Stalingrad, they were not defending the fatherland. They were sacrificing an entire generation of young men for the delusional ambitions of a man in Berlin who never understood the true weight of a general's oath. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a slow meat grinder that crushed the bones and souls of the German Sixth Army. As food supplies evaporated and horse meat became a luxury, Seydlitz watched from his bunker as his soldiers turned into translucent skeletons with rifles in their hands. He was the one who, despite the threat of a court-martial, first raised his voice against Hitler's insane no-retreat order. He watched the Soviet encirclement tighten like a steel noose, while radio transmissions from Berlin brought only hollow, almost hallucinatory promises of a rescue that would never come. In those long, polar nights, surrounded by the stench of dampness, gangrene, and cheap tobacco, something much deeper than military discipline snapped within Seydlitz. He realized that loyalty to the Führer was no longer loyalty to Germany. Looking at the thousands of frozen bodies serving as barricades in the city's ruins, he reached a conclusion that would ruin his life. True treason was not surrendering to the enemy, but remaining silent in the face of his own leader's crimes. January 31st, 1943. The silence that fell over Stalingrad after months of thunder was unbearable, heavier than any artillery barrage. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach entered Soviet captivity, not with a bowed head, but with an icy peace in his eyes. As he was led through the deep snow, surrounded by victorious Red Army soldiers, he did not think about defeat. He thought about responsibility. Unlike Field Marshal Paulus, who sank into an apathetic silence and depression, Seydlitz remained a man of action. While being interrogated in Soviet headquarters, he did not see enemies. He saw a tool. He saw a chance to start a war from the very heart of Russia against what he considered the true enemy of Germany, Adolf Hitler. In those first days of captivity, while his fingers were still numb from the Russian winter, he began to draw plans in his mind for a new German army, an army that would turn and march back west, but with one goal: to tear down the regime that had set Europe on fire. In an isolated prisoner-of-war camp known as the Camp for Generals, Seydlitz launched something history had never known: the League of German Officers. It was a surreal, almost cinematic sight. German generals, in their faded but neat uniforms with red stripes, sitting at wooden tables beneath portraits of Lenin and Stalin. Seydlitz was the heart of this movement. He believed in the impossible, that he could convince the remaining commanders at the front that the war was lost and that the only path to salvation lay in a military coup. His goal was the formation of a free Germany, a state cleansed of the Nazi stain. But the price was horrific. The Soviets used him as their most powerful propaganda weapon. His voice, the same voice that once commanded assaults, now echoed from massive loudspeakers positioned on the very front lines, calling his former comrades to lay down their arms and betray their oath. To the soldiers in the trenches, he was no longer the hero of Stalingrad. He had become Stalin's general, a man who sold Prussian honor for a bowl of warm soup. Imagine the scene: a dark night on the Eastern Front, silence broken only by the cracking of ice in the woods. Suddenly, through the fog, a voice echoes that every German officer recognizes by its authority and tone. It is Seydlitz. "Soldiers, you have not been betrayed by me. You have been betrayed by the man who sends you to your death from the comfort of his bunker." His words were like acid eating away at the Wehrmacht's morale. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels raged, ordering Seydlitz's name to be erased from all archives, except those dealing with treason. Hitler condemned him to death in absentia, labeling him biological waste. But Seydlitz went even further. He proposed to Stalin the formation of a Seydlitz army, a corps of 40,000 German prisoners who, armed with Soviet weapons, would break through the front lines and topple Hitler. It was a gambling move that scared even Stalin. The Soviet dictator never fully trusted him. To Stalin, Seydlitz was just a useful puppet, while Seydlitz, in his naivety, believed he was an equal partner in saving Germany from total destruction. Treason in the Third Reich was never a personal matter. When news of Seydlitz's alliance reached the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler activated the Sippenhaft Law, the principle of collective family responsibility. His wife and daughters, noble women who had been at the top of society just yesterday, were arrested and thrown into prison. Their property was confiscated, and the family name dragged through the mud. Seydlitz, isolated in Russia, received this news with devastating delays. It was the hardest battle he ever fought, the battle between love for his family and the fanatical conviction that he must destroy Hitler for Germany to survive. As he sat in his room in the camp, writing manifestos about freedom, he knew that every sentence he wrote tightened the noose around his wife's neck. He became a man without a country, without a family, and without an army, living in a vacuum between two totalitarian regimes that used him and doubted him in equal measure. His daughter later recalled, "Father chose Germany, but in the process he lost us." As the war drew to a close and Soviet troops entered Berlin, Seydlitz realized the bitter truth. He was not a liberator. He was merely a tool that had been spent. The Russians no longer needed him for propaganda, because the Red Army was already victoriously marching on German soil. His dream of entering Berlin at the head of a new German army collapsed like a house of cards. Instead of thanking him, the Soviets kept him in captivity after the war. Stalin, never forgetting that Seydlitz was still a German general, decided he was too dangerous to be free. In 1950, at a show trial in Moscow, the man who betrayed Hitler to help the Russians was sentenced by those same Russians to 25 years in prison for war crimes committed in the Wehrmacht. It was the peak of historical absurdity. Seydlitz sat in a Soviet solitary cell, while in West Germany, his former colleagues called him a red traitor. He was a man who fell between two historical plates that collided and crushed him. In 1955, following the intervention of Chancellor Adenauer, Seydlitz was finally released and returned to West Germany. But it was not a hero's welcome. He was met with a coldness worse than that of Stalingrad. His former comrades, generals now building the new Bundeswehr, refused to shake his hand. To them, he had broken the most sacred thing, the military oath. Although he argued that the oath to Hitler was null and void, the military courts refused to restore his rank or pension. He lived in seclusion in Bremen, a ghost of the past who pleased no one. To the right, he was a traitor. To the left, a former Nazi general. Even his family, who suffered because of his decisions, bore scars that time could not heal. Seydlitz spent his days walking by the sea, a man who sacrificed everything for an idea, only to realize that history rarely forgives those who try to play by their own rules in the middle of a war of worlds. Only toward the end of his life, in the late 1970s, did the image of Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach begin to slowly change. A younger generation of historians began to see in him an early seed of resistance, a man who had the courage to say no when the entire nation said yes. They realized that his act in Stalingrad was an act of desperate patriotism, not cheap betrayal. Yet, he remained a deeply wounded man until his last breath. In his memoirs, he wrote of the constant pain caused by the fact that his homeland rejected him, while the regime he tried to topple led Germany into the abyss he had predicted. His death in 1976 passed almost unnoticed in the major media, but in military circles, his name still sparks fierce debates about where loyalty to the state ends and loyalty to humanity begins. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach died in Bremen in 1976, quietly and almost forgotten. Until his final day, he maintained that he did the only right thing an officer could have done at that time. His fate remains a heavy warning of how expensive it is to be a man of conscience during a total war. Today, history remembers him as a man who lost everything: his rank, his honor, his family, and his homeland, all to try and save the soul of his country. He remained a general without an army, a patriot disowned by both sides, and an eternal symbol of the most difficult moral dilemma in the history of warfare. 1944. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was sentenced to death in Berlin for high treason. 1950. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison in Moscow by the very people he had tried to help. 1996. Russian authorities posthumously rehabilitated him, acknowledging that the charges against him were fabricated and politically motivated. His family survived the war, but the scars of betrayal and persecution remained for decades. This film is dedicated to those who had the courage to say no, even when it cost them everything.